Somewhere beneath the cold black surface of the North Atlantic, a steel cylinder no wider than a city bus moved in total silence. No lights, no sound except the slow groan of pressurized metal and the soft breath of 40 men in a space smaller than most people's homes. Outside, the ocean pressed in at pressures that could fold iron like paper. Above, the enemy listened, waiting for the faintest vibration, the smallest acoustic whisper, any sign that something was alive down there in the dark. This is not a story about machines. It is a story about men who chose voluntarily to go beneath the surface of the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth, in the middle of a world war, in vessels that were by the most generous technical assessment frighteningly fragile. Men who became legends not because some propaganda office decided to make them famous, but because what they accomplished, at sea, alone, against overwhelming odds, was genuinely extraordinary. 3 names rise above all others when the history of Germany's submarine force in the Second World War is written. 3 commanders whose careers, whose choices, whose fates form the spine of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Otto Kretschmer, called Silent Otto, the most successful submarine commander in the tonnage of the entire war. Günther Prien, the bull of Scapa Flow, whose single audacious raid in the autumn of 1939 shocked the entire world. And Erich Topp de Rote Teufel, the Red Devil who outlived the war to tell a story that most of his contemporaries never got the chance to finish. If you have stumbled onto this video, there is a decent chance you are already horizontal. Good. That is exactly where we want you. This documentary is built for the long hours, for the slow drift between consciousness and sleep, for the kind of night where your mind needs something to follow but your body needs to rest. The narration will guide you through the full arc of the U-boat war from the first patrol to the final surrender, and you do not need to catch every word. The story will still be there when you drift back in. It always is. What you are about to hear is the result of archival reconstruction, historical record, and documentary craftsmanship. Every name, every vessel designation, every tactical decision described in this script comes from documented historical sources. Where records are incomplete or contradictory, as they often are in wartime, the narration will tell you so honestly. We will not invent what we do not know, but we will show you what the evidence suggests, and we will let the weight of that evidence speak. So settle in. The Atlantic is cold tonight. The convoy is 3 days out of Halifax, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, a periscope is rising. Chapter 1. The Ocean Before the War. Building the Wolves. Before a single torpedo was fired in anger across the North Atlantic, before the first distress signal crackled through a wireless operator's headphones, before the word convoy became synonymous with survival, there were men in rooms in Germany, studying maps, calculating tonnage requirements, and asking a question that would define the coming decade. How do you strangle an island nation? Britain had always been vulnerable in one specific geometric way. An island survives on imports. Food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, all of it arrives by sea. In the First World War, Germany had identified this vulnerability and launched a submarine campaign that came, at various points, genuinely close to forcing Britain's hand. By early 1917, that campaign was sinking Allied shipping at a rate the British Admiralty described, in private, as unsustainable. Only the belated introduction of the convoy system merchant ships travelling together under military escort had turned the tide. Karl Dönitz remembered this. He had served in the First World War as a submarine officer, had been captured in the Mediterranean in 1918, and had spent his years as a prisoner of war thinking about what had gone wrong. The answer, as he saw it, was simple. Submarines had been used individually, one boat against one target, a slow and wasteful method that allowed the enemy to concentrate its defensive resources. What was needed was coordination, concentration, multiple boats striking simultaneously from multiple angles, overwhelming convoy escorts before they could respond. Dönitz called his concept Rudeltaktik. The Allies would call it something rather more vivid, the Wolf Pack. The problem was that in 1935, when Germany quietly resumed building a submarine force in violation of the treaties that had ended the previous war, Dönitz was given almost nothing to work with. The Versailles settlement had not permitted Germany a submarine arm at all. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 changed this, but placed strict tonnage limits on what could be built. Dönitz wanted 300 operational U-boats to execute his Wolfpack strategy effectively, to have enough vessels spread across the Atlantic approaches to maintain constant pressure on convoys, regardless of season, weather, or Allied countermeasures. What he actually received at the start of the war in September 1939 was 57 submarines total, of which only 22 to 27 were suitable for Atlantic operations at any one time. It was a remarkable gap, the distance between the force needed to execute a strategic vision and the force that actually existed. Dönitz went to war with what he had, and the men he sent out, young, trained, carefully selected, deeply motivated, would have to compensate for numerical weakness through individual brilliance. 3 of them in particular would demonstrate what brilliance looked like beneath the surface of an ocean that was trying, at all times, to kill them. Otto Kretschmer was born in 1912 in Heidau, in what was then the German Empire, a region in the Silesian East that would become, after the war, Polish territory. His father was a schoolmaster, and Kretschmer grew up in a household that valued precision, discipline, and intellectual rigor. As a young man, he spent time in Britain, an unusual experience for someone who would later become the Royal Navy's most wanted opponent, and that time gave him something arguably more valuable than any military training, an intuitive understanding of how the British thought. He joined the Reichsmarine in 1930 and transferred to the submarine arm in 1936. Just as the rebuilt German Navy, the Kriegsmarine was beginning to flex its new capabilities. Günther Prien was a different animal entirely. Born in 1908 in the German town of Lübeck, the son of a judge who would later lose his position in the upheavals of the Weimar Republic, Prien grew up in circumstances that were significantly less stable than Kretschmer's. He went to sea as a teenager on merchant vessels, worked his way through the ranks of the German merchant marine, and only joined the Kriegsmarine in the early 1930s. Where Kretschmer was methodical and reserved, Prien was aggressive, instinctive, and possessed of a quality that war has always rewarded: a genuine appetite for risk. He was the kind of officer whose superiors loved him for his results and occasionally worried about him for his methods. Erich Topp, the youngest of the 3 great aces, joined the German Navy in 1934 and moved into the submarine service in October 1937. His early career was unremarkable in the way that all early careers are unremarkable: postings to surface ships, training rotations, the slow, grinding accumulation of technical knowledge that precedes operational command. He served as a watch officer on U-46 before receiving his first independent command. Unlike Kretschmer's cold precision or Prien's volcanic boldness, Topp operated with something closer to controlled ferocity, steady enough to survive where others did not, aggressive enough to succeed where survival alone would have felt insufficient. What bound these 3 men together in the late 1930s was not friendship or philosophy, but circumstance. They were all, in different ways, exactly the kind of officer that Dönitz's emerging submarine doctrine required. Dönitz did not want men who would follow textbook procedures into defeat. He wanted commanders who would absorb the principles of Rudel tactic and then improvise, adapt, and execute under conditions that no textbook had anticipated. He was building a force of hunters, and he was searching, specifically, for men who understood that the ocean was not merely an environment, it was a weapon that could be used by both sides, and the side that used it better would win. The war began in September of 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. Within days, Britain and France had declared war on Germany. The Atlantic, that vast grey expanse between the British Isles and the Americas, became, almost immediately, a contested space. The first U-boat patrols went out within hours of the official declaration of war. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun, and it would not end for nearly 6 years. What follows is the story of the 3 men who came to define its opening years, the years when the hunters were still hunting, before the hunted learned to fight back. Chapter 2. First Blood, Kretschmer and U-23, The first command is a particular kind of test. It asks a man not only whether he can do the job, but whether he knows who he is when the job demands everything from him. For Otto Kretschmer, the first real answer to that question came aboard U-23, a small Type II submarine, sometimes called a canoe by those who sailed in larger vessels, assigned to operations in the North Sea and along the Scottish coastline. The Type II was not a boat built for the Atlantic. It was short, shallow in range, cramped even by the already limited standards of submarine design, and carried a relatively modest armament. What it did teach a commander precisely because of those limitations was economy. There was no margin for waste in a Type II. Every torpedo fired was a decision that could not be reversed. Every diving maneuver consumed battery power that might be needed hours later. Every transmission sent was a signal the enemy could use to triangulate your position. These constraints, which would have frustrated a less disciplined officer, suited Kretschmer's temperament almost perfectly. Limitation for him was not an obstacle. It was a framework for precision. His early patrols established habits that would define his entire career. Kretschmer earned his nickname Silent Otto, not from any personal shyness, but from his deliberate, disciplined refusal to transmit radio messages during operations unless absolutely necessary. In a period when many U-boat commanders communicated freely with headquarters, updating their positions, reporting sightings, confirming attacks, Kretschmer maintained a near-total radio silence that made him, from the perspective of British direction-finding stations monitoring German frequencies, essentially invisible. The enemy could not triangulate what was not being transmitted. This was not a complicated idea, but it required a self-discipline, a willingness to operate without the reassurance of headquarters feedback that many of his peers did not possess. In the waters off the Scottish coast, Kretschmer demonstrated a second characteristic that would become his tactical signature: a preference for one torpedo, one target. Most submarine commanders of the period fired multiple torpedoes at a single vessel to increase the probability of a hit, recognizing that the technology of the period made individual shots uncertain. Kretschmer resisted this impulse. He worked instead on positioning, getting close enough, calculating the shot carefully enough that a single torpedo was sufficient. The mathematics of this approach were compelling. If you could reliably sink a ship with one torpedo, you could sink twice as many ships with the same number of torpedoes. But the operational reality was that it required patience, nerve, and a willingness to close within ranges that made your own boat far more detectable. His early successes off the Scottish coast and in the North Sea included laying mines in the Moray Firth and sinking the British destroyer HMS, daring the loss of a warship representing a particular kind of coup that pure merchant tonnage could not replicate. He also sank the Danish tanker Denmark, among other vessels, establishing a record that was already distinguishing him within the small, closely watched world of the Kriegsmarine's submarine command. Dönitz tracked his men's performances obsessively, comparing tonnage, reviewing patrol reports, identifying the officers who were not merely successful, but who were successful in ways that suggested they would continue to be successful as conditions changed. Kretschmer's name appeared repeatedly at the top of the columns Dönitz's staff maintained. What Dönitz was building, in the first months of the war, was something that had not quite existed in naval history before a culture of individual excellence within a collective strategic framework. The Wolfpack required multiple boats, but it worked because of individual commanders who could hunt independently, who could assess a convoy's speed and course and position themselves ahead of it in darkness, who could penetrate the screen of escort vessels and reach the merchantman within. The best of these commanders were, in a real sense, practitioners of a craft submarine warfare as a form of applied geometry, where the variables were moving, where the margins were lethal, and where the rewards for getting the calculation right were measured in tonnage figures that appeared in the naval logs of both sides. By the spring of 1940, Kretschmer had demonstrated enough in U-23 to earn what he had been building toward: command of a larger, longer-ranged boat. U-99 was a Type 0IB faster, more capable, ocean-going in a way that the North Sea canoe was not. With this boat, Kretschmer would move from early promise to something that the historical record has never quite managed to categorize with a single adequate word. He would become, in the months that followed, the most destructive submarine commander in the history of naval warfare, measured by the tonnage of Allied shipping sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. But in the spring of 1940, as U-99 was being readied for operations and the Norway campaign was reshaping the war's geography, someone else was already the most famous submariner in Germany. Someone whose name was printed on the front pages of newspapers, whose face appeared on magazine covers, whose single night's work in the Scottish waters of Scapa Flow had made him, briefly, the most celebrated man in the German armed forces. That man was Günther Prien, and the story of what he did in October of 1939 and how he did it begins with a map, a tide table, and a commander bold enough to see an opportunity that everyone else had agreed was impossible. Chapter 3. The Bull of Scapa Flow, Prien's impossible raid. There are moments in military history when the gap between what was planned and what was attempted is so wide that it demands a specific kind of personality to cross it. The raid on Scapa Flow in October of 1939 was precisely that kind of moment, a plan so audacious that Dönitz himself had considered it, shelved it, reconsidered it, and finally offered it to one man as something close to a voluntary suicide mission. Scapa Flow is a natural harbour in the Orkney Islands, off the northern tip of Scotland. It had served as the main anchorage of the British Home Fleet in the First World War and had been pressed back into that role at the start of the Second. The anchorage was protected by a combination of sunken block ships, old vessels deliberately sunk in the narrow channels to prevent submarine entry by patrol boats, nets, and the sheer difficulty of the geography. The channels were shallow, the currents were unpredictable, and the base sat in the middle of a heavily monitored stretch of water. British naval intelligence was confident that no submarine could penetrate the anchorage without detection and destruction. The Germans, as a matter of record, had tried during the First World War and failed. Dönitz had a different reading of the charts. His staff had identified that one of the eastern channel's Kirk Sound might, under specific tidal conditions, at a specific hour, offer a path through the block ships to the anchorage beyond. The margins were almost impossibly tight. A submarine attempting the passage would have to navigate between the wrecks in shallow water. On the surface, submerging would have been impossible in the depths available in an area patrolled by British lookouts and under the ambient light of the northern Scottish autumn sky. The plan would require the right commander, someone who would not, at the last moment, decide that the risk was too high and turn back. Dönitz offered the mission to Prien, and Prien studied the charts for 24 hours before accepting. What he saw in those charts, what his mind's eye turned the flat geometry of lines and depth readings into, was not, apparently, a catalogue of obstacles. It was a route. A difficult, dangerous, possibly fatal route, but a route nonetheless. He accepted the mission on the condition that he was given adequate time to prepare, and Dönitz gave him what he needed. On the night of the 13th and into the early hours of the 14th of October, 1939, U-47 entered Kirk Sound on the surface. The passage was everything the charts had suggested. It would be narrow, current-stressed, with the rusting hulls of block ships looming at uncomfortably close quarters. An anchor cable scraped the hull at one point, and the tension aboard U-47 in those minutes must have been something beyond the word tension. Every man on deck knew that if they were spotted by a patrol vessel, by a lookout on shore, by any of the mechanisms the British had assembled to prevent exactly this from happening, there would be no escape. The water was too shallow to dive. The channel was too narrow to turn around. They would either get through or they would not come back. They got through. And what Prien found on the other side of Kirk Sound was the home fleet at anchor in the dark warships sitting still, no blackout in the sense of no movement, the harbour quiet in the confident expectation of safety. He attacked the battleship HMS Royal Oak with 2 separate torpedo runs, and the second run found its mark. Royal Oak, a 29,000-ton warship that had served since the First World War, sank in approximately 13 minutes, taking more than 800 of her crew with her. The escape back through Kirk Sound was, if anything, more nerve-wracking than the entry. There was light on the horizon now, the northern lights, of all things, providing a glow that silhouetted U-47 against the sky for any watching eye. But no pursuit came in time. U-47 cleared the anchorage and headed north, into the open ocean, back toward Germany. The effect of the raid on the German public was electric. Prien and his crew were flown to Berlin, paraded through crowds, received by Hitler personally, decorated, celebrated. The newspapers called Prien the Bull of Scapa Flow, a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. The effect on the British was equally significant, though in a different direction. The block ships were reinforced, the eastern access routes to Scapa Flow were sealed with more permanent barriers, and an urgent review was conducted of the anchorage's defences. The barriers built after Prien's raid, still called Churchill Barriers today, effectively closed the channels that had been exploited on that October night. The specific vulnerability that Prien had identified would never exist again. But the deeper significance of the raid was not tactical, it was psychological. Germany had demonstrated that the British home fleet, in its own harbour, was not untouchable. The Atlantic, that vast contested space where the war at sea would be decided, was suddenly a place where established assumptions about British naval dominance deserved interrogation. Prien had not changed the balance of forces. He had changed the balance of confidence, and in a war that still had nearly 6 years to run, confidence was not a trivial thing. Chapter 4: The Happy Time. 3 Wolves and the Open Ocean. 1940 was the year the war broke open. Germany's spring offensive swept through the Low Countries and France with a speed that left the Allied strategic framework in ruins. By June, France had fallen, and Britain stood, for the first time in the modern era, genuinely alone on the Western Front. Its army evacuated from Dunkirk without most of its equipment, its air force fighting for survival over the Channel, its navy suddenly responsible for protecting a far longer, far more exposed set of Atlantic sea lanes. For the U-boat arm, the fall of France was a gift of geographical and strategic magnitude. The submarine pens at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, the French Atlantic ports, suddenly became available for German use. Before the fall of France, U-boats operating against the North Atlantic convoys had to travel from their bases in the German ports, adding thousands of kilometers to every patrol and reducing the time they could spend in the operational areas. With the French Atlantic bases, the calculation changed dramatically. Transit times were cut, more patrols could be conducted, more tonnage could be sunk with the same number of boats. The period that followed from the summer of 1940 through to the end of October acquired a name among the U-boat crews that has passed, with some irony, into the permanent lexicon of the naval war, Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. It was happy, specifically, for the submarines. For the men aboard Allied merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic, it was something else entirely. From July through to October of 1940, Allied and neutral shipping losses from U-boat attack reached 282 ships, totaling 1,489,795 gross register tons. Those are numbers that describe steel and oil and cargo. They do not describe the crews. It was during this period that Kretschmer, now commanding U-99, moved from success to something approaching legend. His technique in these months was characteristically unconventional. Rather than attacking convoys from outside the escort screen, the standard approach, Kretschmer preferred to penetrate the convoy itself, moving between the columns of merchant ships and firing at close range. The logic was brutal in its elegance. Inside the convoy, an escort vessel could not use depth charges or attack the submarine without risking its own merchant ships. The convoy's defensive geometry, designed to protect against outside attack, became a liability once a submarine was already inside it. Kretschmer would enter a convoy in darkness, move at slow speed on the surface, minimizing his acoustic signature, and pick targets one by one torpedo each, moving deeper into the convoy as he worked. The merchant crews above him knew something was killing them from within and could not find it. Günther Prien, meanwhile, was applying his own brand of offensive aggression to the convoys of the North Atlantic. His approach was less surgical than Kretschmer's, more confrontational, more willing to engage the escort screen directly in the pursuit of targets. He was also more willing to transmit by radio to communicate with headquarters, to coordinate with other boats, which made him both a more visible tactical presence in the Wolfpack and, as the British direction-finding capability improved, a more locatable one. In the autumn of 1940, this difference in style had not yet produced divergent outcomes. Both men were sinking ships, earning decorations, and generating the kind of operational results that Dönitz needed to justify his strategic concept to a German high command that was increasingly focused on the land war and sometimes impatient with the slow arithmetic of tonnage. Erich Topp was in this period still building toward the peak of his operational career. His earlier commands had demonstrated a steady, growing competence, the quiet accumulation of tactical learning that precedes the sudden acceleration of true operational mastery. He had survived an accident with a U-boat in the latter part of 1940 and taken command of U-552, a Type WWII, in December of that year. U-552 would become, in the months and years that followed, one of the most identifiable submarines in the Kriegsmarine. Topp had the boat's conning tower marked with the image of a red devil, a personal emblem that gave the vessel and its commander a name that the Allies would eventually come to know: Der Rote Teufel, the Red Devil. What the happy time represented, in the broadest sense, was a structural imbalance. The Allied convoy system existed, but it was under-defended, not enough escort vessels, not enough air cover, not enough of the technical countermeasures that would eventually be developed to detect and destroy submarines. The U-boats were exploiting a gap between what the defense needed to be and what it actually was. This gap would not last forever. The resources of the British Empire, and eventually the United States, would be brought to bear on closing it. But in the autumn of 1940, with the land war absorbing enormous quantities of Allied attention and material, the Atlantic was a place where the submarine arm was winning clearly, numerically, undeniably winning, and the three men at the heart of that success were at the height of their powers. The happy time would end. Every season ends. But before it ended, it would produce one final defining chapter, a night in March of 1941, that would mark, in retrospect, the precise moment when the tide began to turn. Chapter 5. The Night of the Long Knives, March of 1941. March of 1941 was the month everything cracked. Not in the broad sweep of the war, the land campaigns were still churning forward. The political calculations were still being made in London and Berlin and Washington, but in the specific, intimate world of the North Atlantic, something shifted in the weeks between the end of February and the arrival of spring. Three events, connected by timing and consequence, changed the trajectory of the submarine war in ways that neither side could fully understand in real time. The first loss came without a confirmed explanation, which made it worse in some ways than a loss that could be clearly attributed to enemy action. Günther Prien and U-47 disappeared on or around the 7th of March, 1941, during operations against convoy OB-293 somewhere in the waters west of Ireland. The last confirmed action of U-47 was the torpedoing of a whaling vessel, the Terje Viken, during an attack on that convoy. After that, silence, no further transmissions. No sighting reports, no wreckage. Prien and the entire crew of U-47 simply ceased to exist as operational entities, and then ceased to exist at all. The circumstances of U-47's loss have never been definitively established to the satisfaction of all historians, and the evidence that does exist points in several possible directions simultaneously. What is known is that British destroyer HMS Wolverine made sonar contact during the convoy engagement and attacked. The account of a large underwater explosion consistent with a submarine destruction has been documented, but the details remain contested. Some accounts suggest the possibility of a torpedo malfunction, a so-called circle runner that turned back toward its parent vessel, while others point to the British attack as the most probable cause. The German naval authorities, for their part, did not announce Prien's death until the 23rd of May, 1941, nearly 11 weeks after U-47 had last been heard from. The delay was, in every meaningful sense, a measure of how much the regime had invested in Prien as a symbol. The Bull of Scapa Flow had been the face of German submarine dominance. His decorations, his parades, his public reception by Hitler, all of it had been deployed in the service of a narrative about German military invincibility that the regime needed the German public to believe. Announcing that the man at the center of that narrative was dead, that the most celebrated submarine commander in Germany had been killed at sea without spectacle, without a final battle, without even the grim dignity of a confirmed end, was a piece of information that the propaganda apparatus could not process without revision and delay. He was officially listed as missing first, then presumed dead later, and the newspapers found ways to describe the announcement that emphasized sacrifice over loss. What came next, only 10 days after Prien's last transmission, was if anything more operationally significant. The 17th of March, 1941, found convoy HX-112 in the North Atlantic under escort by several Royal Navy destroyers including HMS Walker and HMS Vanoc. U-99 Kretschmer's boat had been in the area for hours, and so had U-100 under Joachim Schepke, another of the Kriegsmarine's celebrated aces. The night action that followed was one of the most consequential individual engagements of the entire Atlantic campaign. Kretschmer had penetrated the convoy screen in the dark, in the method he had perfected across months of Atlantic operations surface running, slow speed, inside the columns of merchant ships. But on this night, the defensive technology available to HMS Walker and HMS Vanoc had reached a point of capability that changed the balance of the encounter. ASDIC, the British underwater detection system, picked up U-99 as it attempted to disengage from the convoy after completing its attack. HMS Walker's commander delivered a pattern of 8 depth charges that struck close enough to U-99 to cause severe damage across multiple systems: airlines, fuel tanks, ballast tanks. The boat was effectively crippled. Kretschmer's options at this point were narrow. He sent a final radio message to Admiral Dunitz at U-boat headquarters in Lorient, a message that contained an error in spelling in the final transmission that has been preserved in the record, exactly as sent, announcing that U-99 was sinking and asking that his crew be rescued. He then ordered the boat scuttled and his men to abandon ship. 40 of his crew, including Kretschmer himself, were rescued by HMS Walker and became prisoners of war. 3 men were lost. Schepke and U-100 had already been sunk in the same engagement by HMS Vanoc, a single night that removed 2 of the Kriegsmarine's top commanders from the war simultaneously. Kretschmer would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada, eventually being released in 1947. He was 28 years old when he was captured, and he had sunk 47 Allied ships, totaling 274,333 gross register tons in a combat career of approximately 18 months, a record that has never been surpassed by any submarine commander in any navy, in any conflict, before or since. He was, in all the ways that the historical record allows us to measure, the most effective individual practitioner of submarine warfare in the modern era, and he was done. The war would continue without him. Within the space of 10 days in March of 1941, the Kriegsmarine had lost 3 of its most capable operational commanders: Prien missing and presumed dead, Kretschmer a prisoner, Schepke killed. The morale effect within the submarine arm was serious. The propaganda effect, carefully managed by the regime, was contained but not eliminated. And the strategic effect, the gradual, grinding recognition that the British were getting better at finding and destroying the hunters, had begun its long work on the confidence of every man who would subsequently take a U-boat out into the Atlantic. Chapter 6. The Red Devil Rises. Topp and the Long War. Of the 3 great aces, Erich Topp was the one who had to watch what happened to the others and then go back out anyway. This is, in its way, the hardest thing that war asks of the men who survive it long enough to see their peers fall. It asks for a particular form of discipline, the ability to register loss without being paralyzed by it, to continue executing a role that has just demonstrated, in the most unambiguous terms, that it will get you killed if you are not precise enough, or lucky enough, or both. Topp had been building toward operational excellence through the autumn of 1940 and into 1941, commanding U-552 across what would become 10 war patrols, each one a month or more in the North Atlantic, hunting convoys, navigating the progressive improvement in Allied defensive capabilities, refining his understanding of the tactical environment. His boat had become famous in the Kriegsmarine for the red devil painted on its conning tower, a mark of identity that gave the crew a particular kind of unit cohesion, the sense that they were not simply another boat, but a specific vessel with a specific reputation to maintain. This kind of identity mattered in a submarine force where the psychological pressures were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The operational environment in which Topp was working in the first half of 1941 was changing rapidly. The loss of Prien, Kretschmer, and Schepke in March had not ended the U-boat threat. The numbers of operational boats were increasing as the shipyards produced more, but it had introduced a new uncertainty into the calculations of every commander at sea. The British were clearly getting better at this. ASDIC coverage was improving. Escort vessels were becoming more numerous and more experienced. Air cover, while still patchy across the mid-Atlantic gap, was extending its reach. The window of tactical dominance that had characterized the happy time was narrowing, and every experienced commander could feel it. Topp's response to this shifting environment was the one that his career had always indicated it would be: intensified precision, combined with an aggressive willingness to close on targets when the tactical situation permitted. He continued to accumulate tonnage across his patrols on U-552 sinking merchant vessels in the convoy lanes, engaging the Allied logistical system in the grinding arithmetic of the tonnage war that Dönitz had always understood as the fundamental metric of strategic success. By the autumn of 1941, Topp's record placed him firmly among the top tier of active U-boat commanders, the names that Dönitz's staff tracked. The men whose patrols were followed at headquarters with particular attention. Then came the 31st of October, 1941, and an event that transformed the political dimensions of the Atlantic War in ways that extended far beyond the naval tactical balance. Topp and U-552 were operating in the Western Atlantic, in an area where American naval vessels had begun to be encountered with increasing frequency. The United States, not yet formally at war with Germany, was nevertheless providing convoy escort assistance to British shipping under the Lend-Lease arrangements that President Roosevelt had put in place. The legal and diplomatic boundaries between neutrality and belligerence had been blurring for months, and the situation at sea reflected that blurring in specific, dangerous ways. On that October night, U-552 encountered and engaged USS Reuben James, an American Clemson-class destroyer, providing convoy escort for a British convoy bound for Britain. The Reuben James was sunk, becoming the first American warship lost to enemy action in the Second World War. The sinking provoked immediate political debate in the United States and contributed to the pressure on Congress to modify the Neutrality Acts. It was not, by itself, the event that brought America into the war that would come 6 weeks later with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but it was a moment of unmistakable clarity about the direction things were heading. Topp had not merely sunk a warship, he had, without intending to, written a chapter in the political history of a conflict that was rapidly becoming global. The consequences of December of 1941, Germany's declaration of war on the United States following the American declaration of war on Japan, opened a new phase of the submarine campaign. The American eastern seaboard, unprepared for submarine attack, presented a vulnerability that Dönitz was quick to exploit. But that is a story for the chapters ahead. What matters here is that Topp's career had reached a particular kind of operational maturity in these months, a point where technical skill, tactical experience, and accumulated knowledge of the Atlantic environment combined to make him, by any measurement, one of the most dangerous men in German uniform. He had received his Knight's Cross, his Oak Leaves, and would receive his Crossed Swords, the second highest grade of that decoration, in August of 1942. He was also beginning to understand, with the clarity that only sustained operational experience can produce, what the long arc of the submarine war was pointing toward. The happy time was over. The losses of March 1941 had been a signal, not an aberration. The Allies were not going to stop improving their defences. They were not going to run out of resources. They were not going to accept the tonnage losses without finding answers to the tactical problems those losses represented. The question for every U-boat commander who survived into the second year of the war was not whether the operational environment was changing, it clearly was, but whether the submarine arm could adapt fast enough to stay ahead of the defences closing in around it. Topp would keep fighting, he would keep adapting, and he would, unlike Prien, unlike Kretschmer, unlike Schepke, unlike so many of the men who had gone out alongside him in the early patrols, survive. The story of how he did that, and what it cost, and what it meant for a man who outlived his war, belongs to the chapters that follow. But first, the Atlantic itself demands its due, that long, grey, pitiless stretch of water that was not merely the setting for this story but its central character. If you are still with us, welcome back to the surface. The next chapters will take us deeper into the mid-war crisis, the technological arms race that would define the Battle of the Atlantic, and the long reckoning that followed the end of the happy time. But for now, if sleep is pulling at you, let it. The story will be here when you return. That is the only promise this documentary makes, and it keeps it. If you are finding value in this long-form series, the best thing you can do is stay to the end of the video, or let it play through the night. The algorithm reads watch time as endorsement, and your continued listening is the most direct way to tell it that this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling is something you want more of. We will see you in the next chapter. Chapter 7. The Widening Ocean, Operation Drumbeat, and the American Coast. There is a particular cruelty in the way history repeats its errors. Nations that have watched others suffer a specific kind of attack, that have had months, sometimes years, to observe the damage that attack can do, and that have, in theory, the resources and the institutional knowledge to prepare against it, sometimes failed to prepare anyway. The United States Navy, in December of 1941, made exactly this kind of failure, and the cost was measured in thousands of lives and millions of tons of steel and cargo and fuel sent to the bottom of the Western Atlantic. When Germany declared war on the United States on the 11th of December, 1941, 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, in a decision that Hitler made largely on the basis of his alliance obligations to Japan, Admiral Karl Donitz had been waiting for this moment for months, not with bloodlust, but with strategic calculation. He had watched American shipping moving up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States with virtually no defensive organization. Coastal cities were lit at night, their lights visible far out to sea, silhouetting any vessel passing between the shore and a watching submarine. There were no convoy systems operating in American coastal waters. There was no coordinated anti-submarine patrol structure. The United States Navy, which had been observing the Battle of the Atlantic for over 2 years, had made only limited preparations for the submarine threat that now formally applied to its own waters. Donitz launched Operation Paukenschlag, translated roughly as Operation Drumbeat, in January of 1942, sending initially 5 of his largest, longest-ranged U-boats across the Atlantic to operate against the American eastern seaboard. The operational concept was identical to the one that had worked in European waters. Approach undetected, strike in the dark, withdraw before the defense can organize a response, repeat. What was different was the environment. The American coast in the winter of 1941 and 42 was, from a submarine commander's perspective, almost absurdly undefended by comparison to the North Atlantic convoy routes that U-boat crews had been working against for 2 years. The results in the first weeks of Drumbeat were devastating to Allied shipping, and astonishing even by the elevated standards of the happy time. Tankers, freighters, and cargo vessels were sunk within sight of the American coastline, in some cases within sight of resort communities whose residents could see the glow of burning ships on the horizon after dark. The scale of the losses prompted immediate public alarm in the United States and a furious private reckoning within the US Navy about why the warning so evidently available from British experience had not been acted upon more aggressively. The answer, as most institutional failures of this kind reveal on examination, was a combination of bureaucratic resistance, inter-service pride, and the sheer difficulty of shifting a large organization's priorities when those priorities are being disputed from multiple directions simultaneously. Erich Topp was not among the initial 5 boats sent on the first drumbeat patrols. His patrol area in early 1942 included the waters around the British Isles and the mid-Atlantic, but the expansion of U-boat operations into Western Atlantic and American coastal waters was a context that shaped every patrol he conducted in this period. The war was getting bigger. The geography of the submarine campaign was expanding. And as it expanded, the resources of the Allied response were being stretched across a wider front, which meant that in some areas, the defenses were temporarily thinner even as they were growing stronger overall. For a submarine commander operating in the Atlantic in the first half of 1942, the operational environment was contradictory in ways that made tactical prediction genuinely difficult. Some areas were becoming more dangerous, while others were, for the moment, becoming less defended. The second happy time, the American shooting season, as German submarine commanders called it, with a bluntness that the historical record has preserved, lasted from January through approximately August of 1942, before American coastal defenses were reorganized sufficiently to substantially reduce the ease of operations. In those months, the shipping losses off the American eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico reached figures that matched or exceeded the worst periods of the earlier Atlantic campaign. Dönitz, who had spent years arguing to the German High Command that the tonnage war was the decisive campaign of the entire conflict, now had arithmetic that was almost impossible to argue with. The submarines were winning clearly, measurably, in numbers that both sides could calculate. But winning a campaign in the short term and winning a war are not always the same thing. The losses of tonnage off the American coast were real and serious and consequential. What was also real, and what was also accumulating in the background of every triumphant German tonnage report, was the industrial and organizational capacity of the United States, a nation that had just been formally pulled into a global conflict and that was now beginning to apply to that conflict the full weight of the world's largest economy and most productive manufacturing base. The ships being sunk off the American coast were being replaced not immediately, not at first, but with a speed and consistency that the German industrial capacity could not match. The Liberty ship program, the expansion of naval shipyard capacity, the mass production of escort vessels and maritime patrol aircraft, all of it was being assembled and accelerated in the background of the submarine war's most successful phase. Dönitz knew this. He was not an unintelligent man, and the strategic mathematics were available to anyone who chose to run them. The question was whether the submarine arm could sink ships faster than American shipyards, could build them a race between destruction and production that would determine whether the tonnage war could actually be won or merely prolonged. The answer to that question was not yet clear in the first half of 1942, but the direction of the answer was already being set in the shipyards of the American Northeast, in the training camps where anti-submarine crews were being prepared at a rate that Germany could not replicate, and in the laboratories where the technical solutions to the submarine threat were being developed with an urgency that the previous 3 years of war had made absolutely necessary. For Topp and the other surviving U-boat commanders of the Middle War period, the spring and summer of 1942 represented something close to a last operational window, a period when the defenses had not yet caught up with the threat, when a skilled, experienced commander could still find convoys, penetrate their screens, and return to port with results that justified the risk. The tactics that had worked in 1940 were being refined, not abandoned. The Wolfpack coordination that Dönitz had always envisioned was becoming more sophisticated as the communications infrastructure improved, and the sheer number of operational boats reached levels closer to what Dönitz had originally requested. In tonnage terms, 1942 would be the worst year of the war for Allied shipping, the year when the submarine campaign came closest to achieving its strategic objective of severing the Atlantic lifeline that kept Britain in the fight. But the hunters were not the only ones learning. In laboratories and operations rooms on both sides of the Atlantic, a different kind of war was being conducted, a war of intelligence, mathematics, and technology that was, in the long run, more decisive than anything that happened between a submarine and a convoy on the surface of the ocean at night. The story of how that war was fought and how it changed everything belongs to the chapters ahead. But before we go there is a man in a prisoner of war camp in Canada who deserves a moment's attention, because even from captivity, Otto Kretschmer was not quite finished with the war he had been removed from. Chapter 8. Iron Bars and Open Horizons. Kretschmer in Captivity. The silence that descended on Otto Kretschmer's war after the 17th of March, 1941, was complete and immediate. One day he was the most successful submarine commander in the Kriegsmarine, the holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the man whom Dönitz trusted more than perhaps any other individual in the submarine arm. The next day he was a prisoner of war aboard a British destroyer, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, heading toward a captivity that would last longer than the war itself. The British received him with a mixture of professional respect and intelligence curiosity that the historical record has captured in some detail. Kretschmer was, from the Royal Navy's perspective, an extraordinary intelligence asset, the most successful enemy submarine commander who had ever fallen into British hands. Possessed of intimate knowledge of German submarine tactics, technology, and operational practices. The interrogations that followed his capture were thorough, professionally conducted, and, by most historical assessments, not particularly productive from the British side. Kretschmer was not a man who gave away what he did not intend to give away, and the years since his capture have confirmed that he maintained his operational security throughout the interrogation process with the same discipline he had applied to his radio silence in the Atlantic. What the British could observe, however, was something more general and in some ways more valuable than specific technical intelligence: the character of the man. The officers who dealt with Kretschmer in captivity noted, in their reports and in later memoirs, a quality that was consistent across all accounts: a fundamental decency, a professional straightforwardness, an absence of the ideological fervour that the British had encountered in some German prisoners and feared they would find in the most successful enemy commander they had taken. Kretschmer was not, it emerged, a fanatic. He was a naval officer. The distinction, in the context of 1941, was not always easy to make from outside. From inside the interrogation room, it apparently was. He was transferred to Canada to a prisoner of war camp at Bowmanville in Ontario, where he remained for the duration of the conflict and beyond. The conditions at Bowmanville were, by the standards of the Second World War, reasonable. Officers were housed separately from enlisted men, had access to books and educational materials, and were permitted a degree of internal organization that left the senior German officer, which Kretschmer became with meaningful responsibilities over the welfare of his fellow prisoners. He took these responsibilities seriously, in the way he had apparently taken every responsibility seriously throughout his life, with attention, precision, and a practical focus on outcomes rather than display. What is less commonly discussed about Kretschmer's captivity is the degree to which he remained operationally engaged with the war from inside the wire. The prisoner of war camp at Bowmanville was, like most camps housing large numbers of experienced military officers, a place where intelligence activities conducted by both sides were persistent and sometimes elaborate. The German prisoners maintained communication with Germany through covert channels that the camp authorities worked to identify and close as quickly as they were opened. Kretschmer, as the senior German officer, was aware of these activities and, in the historical reconstruction that has been possible from documents declassified in subsequent decades, it appears to have participated in some of them not as an active intelligence operation in the field sense, but as a coordinator and conduit within the camp's internal information network. The full extent of this activity has never been completely established, and the available record leaves questions that the passage of time has made unanswerable. What is known is that information about Allied shipping and convoy patterns was, at various points during the war years, moving through prisoner of war camp communications networks, and that Kretschmer, by virtue of his position, seniority, and the respect he commanded among German prisoners of all services, was at the center of the camp's internal organization. The British authorities were aware, in general terms, that this was happening. The specific question of how much operationally useful information moved through these channels and what effect it had on the war at sea is one that historians have debated without reaching a final consensus. What is beyond dispute is the impression that Kretschmer made on those around him during these years, on British officers, on fellow prisoners, on the Canadian camp staff who dealt with him over the years of his confinement. The accounts that have survived from this period consistently describe a man of exceptional self-possession who had found a way to inhabit captivity without being destroyed by it. He organized educational programs within the camp. He maintained the discipline and morale of the German prisoners under circumstances that offered every temptation toward bitterness and despair. He was, by all accounts, the same man in a prisoner of war camp in Ontario that he had been in command of a Type 0B submarine in the North Atlantic, deliberate, calm, precise, and in control of himself in situations that were specifically designed to remove a man's control. He would remain in Canadian captivity until 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, an extension of imprisonment that reflected the pace at which the repatriation process moved through its administrative stages, rather than any specific judgment about Kretschmer as an individual. He was 35 years old when he returned to Germany, a country that had been transformed beyond recognition in the 6 years of his absence. The country he had left in 1941 no longer existed. The navy he had served no longer existed. The chain of command that had sent him out into the Atlantic Donets, the promotions board, the flag officers and staff officers who had tracked his tonnage figures and awarded his decorations was either dead, imprisoned, or in various stages of the post-war accountability process. He rebuilt, because that, it emerges, was what Kretschmer did with situations that other people might have allowed to define them negatively. He eventually rejoined the German Federal Navy, the Bundesmarine, when it was established in the 1950s, serving with distinction through the Cold War period and retiring with the rank of Commodore in 1970. He died in 1998 at the age of 86, the last surviving member of the trio whose careers this documentary traces, outliving both his famous peers by more than half a century. The man the Atlantic had failed to kill in 1941 lived long enough to see the century turn and the world he had fought in become, in the judgments of later generations, a chapter in a history whose final assessment was still being written. Chapter 9, The Invisible War, Codebreakers and the Atlantic Battle. While the surface war in the North Atlantic was being fought with depth charges and torpedoes and the desperate arithmetic of convoy losses, a different and less visible contest was underway in the intelligence services of both sides, a war of mathematics and interception and cryptographic achievement, whose outcome would prove, in retrospect, to be more decisive than any single tactical engagement on the ocean surface. To understand the Battle of the Atlantic, you cannot ignore the rooms at Bletchley Park and the listening stations and the operational research units where some of the most important work of the entire conflict was conducted in silence, by people whose names the public would not know for decades. Germany's naval communications were encrypted using the Enigma machine, a mechanical device that produced an encryption system of extraordinary complexity, one that the German naval authorities believed to be effectively unbreakable. The machine operated by routing electrical signals through a series of rotating wheels in a sequence that produced a different output for each letter of each message, with the specific encryption dependent on a set of daily key settings that were distributed to all Enigma-equipped stations in advance. Breaking an Enigma-encrypted message was not simply a matter of mathematical cleverness. It required the correct daily key settings, physical access to captured machines or documents, and the computational infrastructure to process the astronomical number of possible combinations at a speed that made the results operationally useful. The British had been working on the German Enigma problem since before the war, building on work done by Polish mathematicians who had made critical early progress in the 1930s. At Bletchley Park, a country house in Buckinghamshire that housed the Government Code and Cipher School, a team that included Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman developed the Bombay, an electromechanical device that could test enormous numbers of Enigma settings at a speed that human calculation could not approach. The naval Enigma, the version used by the Kriegsmarine, was more complex than the version used by the German Army and Air Force, and it took longer to crack. A crucial breakthrough came in May of 1941, when British forces captured Enigma materials from the German weather ship München, and shortly afterward, from the submarine U-110, providing the specific keys that allowed Bletchley Park to read German naval traffic for a sustained period. The operational implications of this capability were enormous, though not immediately apparent in the tonnage figures, because the intelligence had to be used carefully to avoid revealing that it existed. If German naval commanders noticed that convoys were consistently rerouting around U-boat patrol lines, they would eventually conclude that their communications were being read, a conclusion that would prompt an immediate change of encryption procedures and eliminate the intelligence advantage entirely. The British therefore used the Enigma intelligence with careful discipline, ensuring that the rerouting of convoys could plausibly be attributed to long-range aircraft reconnaissance or increased patrol activity, rather than to knowledge of specific U-boat positions derived from decrypted signals. The result was a curious operational dynamic. In periods when the Bletchley Park analysts could read German naval traffic in something approaching real-time, what the intelligence community called good Bletchley periods, convoy losses dropped measurably as ships were rerouted around U-boat patrol lines. In periods when the Germans changed their Enigma key settings or introduced additional complexity that temporarily blinded the codebreakers' blackout periods, convoy losses rose sharply as the intelligence advantage was lost and convoys sailed into patrol areas that could no longer be predicted and avoided. The statistics of Atlantic shipping losses from 1941 onward, examined carefully, contain the signature of this oscillating intelligence relationship, though it took post-war research to make that signature legible. What the U-boat commanders experienced at sea was a confusing inconsistency in their operational results. A patrol area that had produced multiple contacts and successful attacks would sometimes yield nothing on the following patrol, with convoys apparently absent from waters that should, by all rational calculation, have contained them. The commanders attributed this to luck, weather, timing, improved Allied air patrols, to all the explanations that were available short of the correct one, which was that someone, somewhere, was reading their mail. Dönitz himself grew suspicious of communications security during the Middle War period and ordered multiple reviews of Enigma procedure. Each review concluded that the system was secure. The reviews were wrong, but they were also sincere. The possibility that Enigma was being read was, to those inside the German signals intelligence apparatus, genuinely close to unthinkable. The most significant German cryptographic achievement of the Atlantic War was the breaking of Naval Cipher No. 3, the code used for communications between the British Admiralty, the Canadian Naval Command, and the convoy commodores at sea. German naval intelligence operated a code-breaking unit called B-Dienst Beobachtungsdienst, the observation service which had been reading Allied naval communications with varying success since before the war. At certain periods in 1942, B-Dienst was reading convoy routing instructions almost as quickly as the intended recipients, giving Dönitz the ability to position Wolfpack patrol lines directly in the path of convoys whose routes had been determined by signals he could read. This was the mirror image of the Bletchley Park achievement, each side reading the other's communications, each side attempting to exploit that knowledge without revealing that the knowledge existed. The result was an intelligence war being conducted simultaneously with the physical war on the ocean surface, and the two were deeply entangled. The physical war could not be properly understood without the intelligence war, and the intelligence war only mattered because of what was happening on the ocean. Convoy OB-318's successful rerouting in May of 1941, made possible by Enigma decrypts, saved an unknown quantity of shipping and an unknown number of lives. Convoy SC-107's destruction in the autumn of 1942, facilitated in part by B-Dienst intelligence, killed or imprisoned hundreds of merchant sailors and sent dozens of ships to the bottom. These were not random outcomes. They were the products of intelligence contests that were being decided in rooms that neither set of victims knew existed. For men like Topp, operating in this environment without access to the intelligence picture on either side, the experience was one of profound uncertainty, rendered navigable only by discipline and professional skill. He could not know, on any given patrol, whether his patrol area had been compromised, whether the convoy he was hunting had been warned of his position, whether the escort vessels bearing down on him had been directed by aircraft or by some more precise form of knowledge. He could only do what a submarine commander could do: observe, calculate, act, and survive. The invisible war was being fought above and around him, and its outcomes shaped the circumstances of every patrol he conducted. But its machinery was entirely outside his perception or control. Chapter 10. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, where the air could not reach. There was a place in the middle of the North Atlantic, sometimes called the Black Pit by the men who had to cross it, where the mathematics of aircraft range produced a zone of particular vulnerability. Measured in the rough geometry of the day's air power, it lay south of Greenland, west of Iceland, and east of the Canadian and American maritime patrol zones, a roughly circular region of ocean, several hundred kilometers across, where no land-based maritime patrol aircraft could reach, with enough fuel remaining to conduct meaningful operations. In this zone, convoys crossed without air cover, and the U-boats knew it. The significance of air cover to the anti-submarine war cannot be overstated, and it cannot be understood without some appreciation of the specific mechanical vulnerabilities of a U-boat that was detected from the air. A submarine on the surface was fast, maneuverable, and lethal. A submarine being attacked from above, while on the surface, was none of those things. It was a target. The dive time required to take a U-boat from surface to safe depth took approximately 30 seconds under good conditions, and a maritime patrol aircraft arriving over a submarine's position with the element of surprise had a window in which an attack was not merely possible, but almost routine. The loss of submarines to air attack over the course of the Atlantic War was a primary driver of the attrition that eventually broke the U-boat arm's operational effectiveness. But in the Mid-Atlantic Gap, that air threat disappeared entirely. Convoys crossing the gap had only their surface escorts for protection: the destroyers, corvettes, and sloops that Donitz's wolf packs had been trained to defeat through coordinated attack. It was in the gap that some of the worst convoy losses of the entire war occurred, because it was there that the fundamental imbalance between the attacking submarines and the defending escorts was most pronounced. The Battle of Convoy SC-122 and Convoy HX-229 in March of 1943, a combined operation in which wolf packs attacked two convoys simultaneously in the Mid-Atlantic Gap and sank. 22 ships represented the nadir of the Allied convoy defense and the operational zenith of the Wolfpack strategy that Dönitz had been developing and refining since before the war. The solution to the Mid-Atlantic Gap was understood in theory well before it was achieved in practice. Very long-range aircraft, specifically modified versions of the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, with additional fuel tanks replacing bomb capacity could, if enough of them were produced and allocated to maritime patrol, extend air cover across the gap and close the vulnerability. The argument for this allocation was made, persistently and urgently, by the British and Canadian naval commands from at least 1942 onward. The counter-argument, made with equal persistence by the strategic bombing advocates in the Allied air commands, was that the aircraft were more valuable attacking German industrial targets from bases in Britain than patrolling ocean expanses looking for submarines. This debate between the requirements of the Battle of the Atlantic and the requirements of the strategic bombing campaign was one of the central resource allocation conflicts of the Allied war effort. The human cost of the delay in resolving that debate was borne, as the human costs of institutional disputes usually are, by the people who had no voice in the argument. The merchant sailors crossing the Mid-Atlantic Gap in the winter of 1942 and the spring of 1943 were the lived reality of a resource allocation decision being made in committee rooms in London and Washington. When a convoy crossed the gap without air cover, the watchkeepers on the bridge of a merchant vessel knew they were in the worst possible stretch of water days from the point where friendly aircraft could appear, surrounded by ocean that might conceal any number of submarines positioned on information that they, the convoy, could not access. The Wolfpack tactics that Dönitz had refined over 3 years of Atlantic operations were at their most effective in precisely these conditions. Multiple submarines maintaining contact with a convoy during daylight, surfacing at night, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the finite response capability of the escort screen. The system worked. When it worked, as a piece of applied tactical logic that the defensive arrangements of the period had not yet found adequate answers to. The escort commanders who fought these convoy battles with inadequate numbers of ships, inadequate air support, and frequently inadequate intelligence were not defeated men in any personal or professional sense. They were defenders who were trying to hold a line with insufficient resources against an attacker who had, for a specific and temporary period, the operational advantages of numbers, positioning, and surprise. For Erich Topp, the mid-Atlantic operations of 1942 were the context in which his career reached what the record shows was its operational peak. His patrols across this period accumulated a tonnage record that placed him, by the autumn of 1942, third among all U-boat commanders in gross register. Tons of Allied shipping sunk behind only Kretschmer, now in Canada, and Wolfgang Luth, whose career followed a parallel arc through the Middle War years. Topp received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords in August of 1942 from Hitler personally, one of only 2 U-boat commanders to receive that grade of decoration during the war, the other being Kretschmer himself. The decoration ceremonies of the Nazi state were elaborate and significant occasions, and Topp's attendance at one meant a brief return to Germany, a pause in the patrol cycle, a moment of visibility in the official narrative that the regime maintained about its most successful military performers. What Topp thought, privately, about the context in which he received his decoration, the political system he was serving, the ideology that framed his achievements, is a question that the historical record does not answer with complete clarity. What the record does show, and what Topp himself addressed in later decades, is that the experience of the mid-war period, the accumulated losses, the progressive worsening of the operational environment, the realization that the war's trajectory was shifting, was producing, in thoughtful men, a growing dissonance between the official narrative of inevitable German victory and the empirical reality of what was happening at sea. The mid-Atlantic gap would finally be closed. The very long-range aircraft would eventually be allocated in sufficient numbers to provide continuous air cover across the convoy routes. The technical and tactical solutions to the Wolfpack would be assembled: new radar, new weapons, new doctrine, new training, and deployed with an effectiveness that would transform the battle's outcome in the spring of 1943. But that transformation and the human drama that surrounded it belongs to the chapter that follows. Here, in the Black Pit, in the winter of the Middle War, the ocean still belonged, at least at night, to the submarines. Chapter 11, Black May, the turning of the tide. There are months in history that serve as pivot points, not because a single decisive event occurred within them, but because the accumulated weight of multiple changes in technology, tactics, intelligence, and resource allocation all arrived at operational effect simultaneously, producing a shift whose magnitude was visible only in retrospect. For the Battle of the Atlantic, that month was May of 1943. The U-boat arm called it Schwarze Mai, Black May. The events of that spring had been building for longer than any single month. The Allies had spent the winter of 1942 and 43 assembling the components of a counter-strategy that addressed, systematically, each of the tactical and technical advantages that had given the submarine campaign its operational effectiveness in the happy time and the years that followed. New centimetric radar, operating on a wavelength that German detection equipment could not identify, was being fitted to escort vessels and maritime patrol aircraft. The radar that U-boat commanders had come to fear was a broad-spectrum instrument that could be detected and warned against, but the new centimetric equipment gave no warning at all. A U-boat commander surfacing at night now faced the possibility of being illuminated by radar he could not detect, by an aircraft or surface vessel that knew exactly where he was while he remained unaware of its presence. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight fitted to maritime patrol aircraft, designed to be switched on at the last moment of an approach to a surface submarine tracked by radar, turned the nighttime surface transit that had been a U-boat's tactical asset into a vulnerability. Aircraft that had previously been visible in the dark only when close enough to be escaped by diving could now, with radar and the Lee Light in combination, make attacks with very little warning. The subjective experience of this change for submarine crews was one of sudden, shocking elimination of the predictability that had made nighttime surface running feel manageable. Now the darkness that had protected them could, at any moment and without warning, become the medium through which death arrived. At the same time, the very long-range aircraft, the Liberators, that had been argued over in committee rooms for more than a year, were finally being deployed in sufficient numbers to close the mid-Atlantic gap. The symbolic geography of the Black Pit was erased. Convoys crossing the former gap zone now had air cover throughout the crossing, and the tactical environment that had made Wolfpack operations in that zone so productive for Dunitz's commanders ceased to exist. A Wolfpack that surfaced to pursue a convoy in what had been the gap now faced the possibility of aircraft appearing overhead within hours, not days, of being detected. The protective geometry of the unreachable ocean had been annihilated by logistics and production. The escort groups were improving simultaneously. The British and Canadian navies had been training specialized anti-submarine groups throughout the Middle War period, formations built not around the convoy protection mission but around the offensive hunting mission. Groups of destroyers and frigates tasked specifically with finding and destroying submarines rather than merely shepherding merchant ships. Captain Frederick John Walker, arguably the most effective anti-submarine commander of the entire war, had been developing and refining offensive anti-submarine tactics since 1941. And by 1943, his methods had been codified and distributed across the Atlantic escort forces. The defensive crouch that had characterized early convoy escort doctrine was being replaced by something more aggressive, more technically demanding, and substantially more lethal to the submarines. The results in May of 1943 were catastrophic for the U-boat arm in a way that the tonnage figures alone do not fully capture. 41 U-boats were destroyed in that single month in waters ranging from the North Atlantic convoy routes to the Bay of Biscay, where British aircraft had begun systematically attacking submarines on their transit routes to and from the French Atlantic bases. 41 boats meant 41 crews, most of them gone entirely. The death rate among operational U-boat crews in May of 1943 was such that a submarine going to sea in that month was, by the actuarial calculations available from the operational record, more likely not to return than to return. The mathematics of this reality were understood inside the U-boat arm, though not publicly announced. Dönitz withdrew the U-boat force from the North Atlantic convoy routes in late May of 1943, an extraordinary acknowledgement of defeat in the primary strategic arena of the war's longest campaign. He described the decision, in the language of his headquarters communications, as a temporary redeployment while tactical conditions were reassessed and new countermeasures developed. Operationally, this was partly true. The U-boat arm did not cease to exist in May of 1943, and the war at sea continued for another 2 years. But the specific operational concept that had come within reach of severing Britain's Atlantic lifeline, the Wolfpack campaign against the North Atlantic convoys, had been broken in a single month, and it would never be fully reassembled. For Erich Topp, Black May arrived during a period when his own relationship with the frontline operational role was changing. He had by this point completed the series of combat patrols that constituted his principal contribution to the tonnage war, and the trajectory of his career in the latter part of 1942 and into 1943 was moving him progressively toward training and command roles that kept him, for extended periods, away from active patrols. This was not unusual for the senior aces who survived into the Middle War period. Experience was scarce enough that Dunitz's staff increasingly assigned the best surviving commanders to positions where their knowledge could be transferred to the larger numbers of less experienced crew members who were flowing through the training pipeline as the U-boat force expanded numerically while its operational effectiveness contracted. The men who died in Black May were, in many cases, exactly those younger, less experienced commanders who had received their boats only months earlier, products of an accelerated training program that had compressed the learning curve of submarine warfare into an inadequate period, precisely because the losses were consuming experienced crews faster than the training system could replace them at its original pace. The relationship between this compressed training and the elevated casualty rate of the later war period is one that the post-war analysis has established with some confidence. Crews who had spent less time training, under commanders who had had less time to develop the judgment that survival in the Atlantic required, were dying at a faster rate than the cohort of experienced commanders who had gone out in the happy time. The ocean in the summer of 1943 was a different place from the ocean of 1940. The hunters had become the hunted in a transformation so complete that the tactical asymmetry of the relationship had reversed itself. A U-boat that surfaced was now, in most areas, at greater risk than the convoy it was trying to attack. The air, the water, the radar spectrum, all of it was, increasingly, hostile territory for the submarine. Black May was the moment that transformation became undeniable, and the U-boat arm entered the final phase of the Atlantic War knowing, whatever the official communiques said, that the direction of the battle had changed permanently. Chapter 12. Deeper and Darker. The U-boat arm's last years. Wars have a particular quality in their final phases that the beginning and middle do not possess. The combination of diminishing probability of success with the irreducible reality of continuing loss. Men continue to die for objectives that the informed observer can see are no longer attainable, within a strategic context that has already been decided against them, and the question that history later asks, why did they keep going, has answers that are complicated and uncomfortable and do not fit easily into single explanations. The U-boat arm after Black May was an institution in a state of profound crisis that its leadership was managing with a mixture of genuine tactical response and controlled self-deception. Dönitz, who became Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in January of 1943 following the resignation of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, and who would briefly succeed Hitler as head of state in the final days of the war in Europe, was not a man who processed the evolving operational situation with detachment. He had invested 3 decades in the submarine arm. It was, in the deepest sense available to an officer of his generation and background, his creation. The men dying in the Atlantic were, in many cases, men he had trained personally, whose careers he had tracked, whose families he knew. The language of his communications and his post-war memoir reflects a degree of identification with the submarine force that made the losses of the later war not merely operationally significant, but personally devastating in ways that the institutional record cannot fully accommodate. The technical response to Black May was real and, in certain respects, impressive. The schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed a submerged submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining underwater, eliminating the need to surface for air intake and battery charging, was developed and deployed progressively from 1943 onward. The schnorkel did not make U-boats invisible to the improved Allied radar, which could detect the schnorkel mast itself under some conditions, but it substantially reduced the frequency with which submarines had to expose their full hull to surface detection. The operational profile of a schnorkel-equipped U-boat was different from that of its predecessors, slower, less flexible, operationally constrained by the requirement to use the breathing tube in specific sea states, but it was survivable in a way that the surface-running tactics of the earlier war were no longer survivable. New weapons were also being developed and deployed. The acoustic torpedo, the Zaunkönig, called the GNAT by the Allies, was designed to home on the propeller noise of escort vessels, allowing submarines to attack the destroyers and corvettes that had been the principal instruments of their destruction. The weapon was introduced in the autumn of 1943 and produced initial successes that temporarily alarmed the Allied escort commands. The Allied counter, deployed with remarkable speed, was a towed acoustic decoy called the Foxer, a device that generated propeller noise behind a ship, distracting the acoustic torpedo from its intended target. The speed with which the Foxer was developed and deployed from the first operational encounter with the Zaunkönig to the deployment of an effective counter took weeks rather than months, was itself a measure of the Allied technical response capability that the later war period had developed. Erich Topp, operating in this environment in the later war period, continued to serve in positions that reflected his status as one of the few surviving senior aces from the early war cohort. He commanded U-2052 in the autumn of 1944, one of the new Type XXI boats that represented Germany's most ambitious technical response to the Allied anti-submarine capability. The Type XXI was a fundamentally different design philosophy from the Type 7 that had been the backbone of the earlier campaign, faster submerged than surfaced, equipped with a large battery capacity that allowed extended underwater operation, fitted with a snorkel as standard, and capable of deep diving that placed it below the effective depth of the weapons the Allies were using. Had it been available in large numbers in 1942, the Type XXI might have meaningfully extended the effectiveness of the submarine campaign. In the autumn of 1944, with Allied forces advancing through France and the German industrial base being systematically destroyed from the air, the Type XXI was a weapon of impressive design capability, arriving too late to change an outcome that was already being determined on the land front. The men who were still going out in U-boats in the winter of 1943 and into 1944 and 1945 were, by any honest reckoning, being sent on missions from which the probability of return had fallen to levels that made the term operational deployment seem like a euphemism for something else entirely. The overall casualty rate of the U-boat arm across the war was approximately 75% of the approximately 40,000 men who served in operational U-boats. Approximately 30,000 did not survive the war. This figure has no precise analogue in the casualty statistics of any other branch of any armed force in the Second World War. It is measured as a proportion of force committed, a loss rate that defies easy contextualization. For the men who continued to sail in the knowledge of those proportions, and by 1943 and 44, the experienced survivors knew roughly what the numbers were. Even if they were not officially published, the question of motivation is one that the post-war testimonies of survivors have addressed in ways that do not reduce easily to slogans. Duty in the strict, professional military sense of executing the role you have been assigned within an institution you have joined and trained for was a genuine motivating factor, and not merely a retrospective excuse. Loyalty to the men beside them, the specific, immediate, irreplaceable loyalty of the small unit that has shared extreme experience, was perhaps more powerful than any abstract institutional commitment. Fear, in its various forms, was present too, though its specific character shifted over the course of the war. Early fear was of the ocean and the enemy. Later fear included the fear of becoming the thing that broke, in a world where the men around you had not broken. Topp survived. He was one of the relatively small cohort of the early aces, the men who had gone out in the happy time, who had sunk tonnage in the open ocean, who had lived through the transition from hunters to hunted, who lived to see the war's end. He was withdrawn from active patrol command in the later war period, serving in staff and training roles that were genuinely important to the institution, but that removed him from the direct operational risk of the frontline boats. The historical record does not capture, with any precision, what he thought or felt about the men who continued to go out after he had been moved to the relative safety of shore-based command. The gap between the survivor and the dead is one that the survivors of every war have found difficult to articulate, and that the historical record, trained as it is on events rather than on the texture of private experience, captures only imperfectly. The U-boat arm continued to fight until the very last days of the European war. The final operational patrols were still at sea when Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. The boats were ordered to surface, fly a black flag of surrender, and report their positions to Allied authorities. Most complied. Some scuttled their vessels rather than hand them over, in a final act of institutional defiance that the post-war courts addressed with varying degrees of seriousness. The last chapter of the Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle at all, it was an administrative act, conducted in the grey waters of the North Sea and the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, by men who had spent years beneath the surface of oceans that were trying to kill them, and who had finally been ordered, by the authority that had sent them out, to stop. You have now heard the arc from the ocean's beginnings to the breaking of the wolf pack. If sleep has found you somewhere in these hours, good. If you have stayed with every word, welcome to the company of those who cannot let this story go quietly. The final 6 chapters lie ahead: the aftermath, the reckoning, the post-war lives of the survivors, and the long, slow accounting that history makes of men who fought in the deep water. We will be here when you are ready. If this documentary is giving you something, a night's company, a thread to follow into sleep, a connection to a history that deserves to be known, consider leaving it playing. Every hour of watch time tells the algorithm that long-form, careful history has an audience, and that audience keeps this work alive. Chapter 13, The Last Patrols. When courage becomes something else. There is a kind of courage that the history books celebrate easily: the charge, the stand, the single decision made under fire that turns a battle. And then there is a kind of courage that history finds harder to name because it looks, from the outside, almost identical to helplessness. The U-boat crews of 1944 were exhibiting that second kind. They were going out knowing, with a clarity that the first generation of aces had never been asked to possess, that the odds were no longer with them, that the ocean they were entering was now a space controlled, in every meaningful tactical dimension, by the enemy. And they went anyway. By the middle of 1944, the geometry of the Atlantic War had inverted so completely that the tactical relationship of the early years, submarines, hunting convoys, escorts scrambling to respond, had been replaced by something that more closely resembled the escorts hunting submarines, with the convoys as incidental geography. Allied support groups, those specialized offensive anti-submarine formations that Captain Walker and others had pioneered, were now active throughout the North Atlantic, not waiting for convoy attacks to develop, but actively prosecuting submarine contacts as primary offensive objectives. A U-boat detected in the North Atlantic in 1944 was not encountering a defensive response. It was encountering a hunting party that had been specifically trained and equipped for exactly this purpose. The tools available to those hunting parties had also continued to evolve throughout 1943 and into 1944 at a pace that the German technical response could not match. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that projected a spread of contact-fused projectiles ahead of an attacking vessel, had replaced the astern-throwing depth charge as the primary anti-submarine weapon on many escort vessels, closing a tactical gap that submarines had previously been able to exploit during the blind period of a depth charge attack when the attacking vessel passed over the submarine's position. The Squid, a more advanced ahead-throwing mortar, capable of being set to explode at the precise depth calculated by the ASDIC, was entering service on the most modern escort vessels by 1943-44. The progressive accumulation of these weapons, fitted to vessels manned by crews of growing experience and guided by intelligence of improving quality, made the Atlantic a fundamentally different fighting environment from the one that Prien, Kretschmer, and the early generation of aces had navigated. The Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats that were the workhorses of the late war campaign were the same basic designs that had gone to sea in 1939 and 1940. They had been modified, improved in detail, fitted with better anti-aircraft armament, given the schnorkel when the program matured, but their fundamental performance envelope had not changed in the ways that the Allied countermeasures had changed. A Type WWII of 1944 was not meaningfully faster or more capable in combat than a Type WWII of 1940. The Atlantic defense of 1944 was enormously more capable than the Atlantic defense of 1940. This structural asymmetry static submarine capability against rapidly improving anti-submarine capability was the underlying mathematics of Black May and of everything that followed it. The crews going out in this period were also, on average, younger and less experienced than those who had preceded them. The training pipeline had been lengthened from its wartime compressed schedule in an attempt to improve the quality of newly deployed crews, but the pool of experienced officers available to command new boats and to serve as watch officers and mentors was being depleted by casualties faster than it could be replenished by the training system. The institutional knowledge, the intuitive feel for the ocean that a commander like Kretschmer had developed across 2 years of North Sea and Atlantic operations was not something that could be compressed into a training. Of course, however well designed, it was acquired at sea, under operational conditions, over time. And time was exactly what the late-war U-boat arm did not have. What kept the force operational, in the face of these realities, was a combination of institutional momentum, professional obligation, and the specific ideology of the regime under which these men served, an ideology that placed an exceptionally high value on continued resistance in the face of deteriorating circumstances, that treated the acceptance of unfavorable odds not as a rational assessment, but as a moral failing. The men who went out in U-boats in 1944 and 45 were not unaware of the probability of their deaths. The loss rate was visible in the face of every crew that did not return to port, in the empty berths in the submarine base accommodation, in the official communications that arrived at headquarters with a frequency that the staff officers processing them could not have become entirely accustomed to, whatever the professional training demanded. They went anyway, because the institutional culture they inhabited and the authority structures they were embedded in gave them no legitimate alternative. Erich Topp had, by this period, moved substantially away from frontline patrol command. His later war roles involved training, staff work, and the supervision of the new boat programs, including the Type XXI development that represented Germany's attempt to produce a technological counter to the Allied anti-submarine superiority. He was intimately familiar with the late-war operational environment through his role in these programs, and the testimony that he provided in the post-war decades suggests a man who understood, clearly and without self-deception, what the last years of the Battle of the Atlantic had actually been. He did not, in later life, dress the late-war losses in the language of heroic sacrifice. He described them with the directness that characterized his public statements across the decades after the war as a tragedy that the arithmetic of the conflict had made inevitable long before the last boats went out. The Bay of Biscay had become a particular killing ground by 1943 and 44. The transit routes between the French Atlantic bases and the open ocean passed through waters that British Coastal Command had, by this point, saturated with long-range patrol aircraft equipped with the new centimetric radar and lee lights. Submarines transiting on the surface as they had to make reasonable speed, were being detected, illuminated, and attacked with a frequency that turned the Bay of Biscay passage into a gauntlet that exacted a toll before a boat had even reached its operational area. The response of forcing U-boats to submerge for the entirety of the bay transit was technically possible, but operationally punishing it consumed battery capacity, reduced transit speed dramatically, and arrived at the Atlantic patrol area with a crew already tired and a boat whose systems had been working continuously since departure. The last patrols of the Atlantic War are not stories that end with triumph or resolution. They are stories that end with silenced boats that transmitted their departure messages and were never heard from again, listed as overdue, then as missing, then as lost with all hands in the careful bureaucratic language that stands in for the specific, catastrophic, irreversible reality of a submarine destroyed at depth. For the families waiting on shore in the port towns of the French Atlantic coast and the German North Sea harbours, the notification arrived with a formality that gave the grief no adequate container. The war was something happening at great distance, in deep water, in darkness, and the men it consumed simply ceased to exist without explanation, or witnesses, or the ordinary rituals that other kinds of death permit. And yet the boats continued to go out. Until the very last week of the war in Europe, U-boats were at sea on operational patrols. The final page of the Battle of the Atlantic was not written by any decisive engagement or any identifiable tactical turning point. It was written by the order that came on the 4th of May, 1945. The order transmitted to all U-boats at sea to cease hostilities and surface under the terms of Germany's impending surrender. The boats that received that order had already survived the most dangerous campaign any naval force in the modern era had been asked to conduct. They had made it to the end. Not all of them would make it home. Even then, some were lost in the confusion of the final days, some scuttled by their own crews, Some handed over at surface rendezvous points to Allied vessels that had spent years trying to sink them. The end of the last patrols was a quiet thing, conducted in grey water under grey skies, and it completed a campaign that had opened 6 years earlier with enormous confidence and closed with the specific, exhausted dignity of men who had simply continued until there was nothing left to continue against. Chapter 14. Surrender and Silence. The End of the Atlantic War. The 8th of May, 1945, arrived in the North Atlantic, as it arrived everywhere else that the war in Europe reached, not with a single dramatic moment of silence, but with a gradual, uneven, geographically complicated process of communication and compliance and disbelief. The war that had begun in September of 1939, with specific orders transmitted to specific vessels in specific grid squares of ocean, ended with orders transmitted to vessels whose positions were, in many cases, unknown even to the headquarters sending the orders. The Atlantic is very large. The boats still at sea on the day Germany surrendered were operating across its full breadth, from the waters east of Canada to the approaches of the British Isles, and the message ordering them to surface and surrender reached some of them quickly and others only after days of uncertainty. Dönitz issued the order to all U-boats at sea in direct, unambiguous terms. They were to surface, fly a black pennant as a symbol of surrender, report their positions to Allied authorities, and proceed to designated surrender points. The operational language was precise and characteristic. Even in surrender, the headquarters communications had the quality of orders rather than pleas. Dönitz had been appointed Hitler's successor as head of state in the final days of the Reich, a designation that Hitler had made in his final political testament before his death in the Berlin bunker, and in that brief, anomalous capacity he had overseen Germany's final capitulation. The appointment was one of the stranger coincidences of the war's closing chapters. The man who had built and commanded the submarine arm, who had directed the campaign that had come closest to deciding the war's outcome in the Atlantic, ended the European conflict in the formal position of head of state of a country that had ceased to exist as a functioning entity. The U-boats at sea responded to the surrender order in ways that reflected the range of human responses to the collapse of the context that has given a life, its structure and purpose. The majority complied. They surfaced, they flew the designated signals, they reported their positions, they were met by Allied vessels and escorted to surrender ports. Some commanders went through the motions of compliance while ordering the scuttling of their boats, opening seacocks, triggering explosive charges before abandoning ship, ensuring that the vessels themselves at least would not pass intact into Allied hands. Operation Regenbogen, a planned mass scuttling of the German submarine fleet, had been ordered and then countermanded in the final days, but the countermand reached some commanders too late or was disregarded by others who felt that the surrender of a vessel they had commanded in combat was a step too far for what their personal honour could accommodate. At Lissaharley in Northern Ireland and Loch Erebol in Scotland, the surrendered U-boats gathered in numbers that would have seemed fantastical in any of the years when these same vessels had been the most feared weapons in the German arsenal. The images that have survived from these surrender anchorages show submarines lined up in harbour hulls showing the wear of Atlantic service, conning towers bearing the identifying markings that individual commanders had adopted as unit emblems, crews standing at attention or assembled on decks in the procedures that military surrender requires. The men in those images were mostly young. Many of them were very young indeed, products of the accelerated training programs of the later war years, who had joined the submarine arm in the shadow of Black May and gone to sea knowing the statistics and gone anyway. The accounting of what the Battle of the Atlantic had cost was conducted in the years that followed with the methodical thoroughness of post-war official histories and the less methodical, more painful thoroughness of the families and communities that had absorbed the losses. The Allied merchant navy had lost more than 3,500 ships sunk by German submarines across the war, amounting to approximately 14.5 million gross register tons. Approximately 36,000 Allied merchant sailors had been killed at sea, men who were, in most national jurisdictions, technically civilians rather than military personnel, whose deaths were therefore processed through different bureaucratic channels and received, in the immediate post-war period, less of the formal commemoration that military casualties generated. The injustice of this was acknowledged periodically by various official bodies in the decades that followed and never quite adequately addressed. On the German side, of the approximately 860 U-boats that saw operational service, approximately 784 were destroyed or lost. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in operational U-boats, approximately 30,000 were killed, a mortality rate of roughly 75% that has no close parallel in the armed forces of any combatant in any major conflict in the modern era. These figures were assembled carefully by the naval historians who had access to the records on both sides, and their scale surprised even people who had lived through the war and considered themselves informed about its costs. The submarine war had eaten its participants with a thoroughness that was visible in the statistics, but that the statistics, by themselves, cannot make fully real. The French Atlantic bases Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, that had been the operational heart of the U-boat campaign since 1940, were surrendered to Allied forces, though the massive reinforced concrete submarine pens that the organisation Topp had constructed over 3 years of intensive labour proved resistant to the symbolic demolition that might otherwise have been expected. The pens had been designed to withstand aerial bombardment, and they had withstood it throughout the war with remarkable effectiveness, protecting the boats inside from the Allied air campaign that had targeted them. They proved, in the post-war era, equally resistant to the desire to erase them too massive, too expensive to demolish completely, too structurally embedded in the port infrastructure to simply remove. Many of them stand today, adapted to peacetime commercial purposes, their architecture, a monument to the particular combination of engineering, ambition, and strategic desperation that produced them. The senior commanders of the U-boat arm faced, in the months and years after the surrender, the process of post-war accountability that the Nuremberg trials and the associated military tribunals had established. Dönitz was indicted before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg on charges that included unrestricted submarine warfare, the policy of attacking merchant vessels without warning that had been both standard German practice and, as the defence successfully argued, a practice that the Allied navies had also conducted against their enemies. The Nuremberg court ultimately convicted Dönitz on 2 of the 3 counts he faced and sentenced him to 10 years imprisonment, a sentence that reflected the tribunal's assessment of his role in the broader German war. Effort while acknowledging, through the specific exclusion of certain charges, the moral complexity of submarine warfare conducted within the context of a total war that all combatant powers had prosecuted without the restraints that peacetime law prescribed. Dönitz served his sentence at Spandau prison and was released in 1956. He lived until 1980, publishing memoirs and maintaining, throughout his later life, a position on the submarine campaign and his own conduct that was consistent but contested the position of a professional naval officer who had executed a legitimate military strategy within the parameters of his orders and his authority, without the ideological responsibility for the broader crimes of the regime he had served. The debate about that position has not been definitively resolved by any single historical assessment, and the range of scholarly opinion on the moral accounting of Dönitz's career reflects the genuine difficulty of judgment in cases where military professionalism and political complicity are as entangled as they are in the senior officer corps of totalitarian states at war. What cannot be disputed is that the campaign he directed was the longest and in some ways most consequential of the entire war, and that the 3 men at the center of this documentary were among the most significant individual practitioners of that campaign's most critical phase. Chapter 15. The Long Reckoning. Survivors, Memory, and the Weight of the Atlantic. The men who came home from the Atlantic came back to a Germany that was, in every physical and institutional sense, a different country from the one they had left. The cities were damaged, in many cases catastrophically. The government had ceased to exist. The military hierarchy that had structured their professional identities had been dissolved, its senior figures either dead or awaiting judicial process, its records scattered across the administrative confusion of occupation and partition. The returning U-boat crew member who had left a port in Brest or Lorient in 1942 or 43 arrived back in a country that offered no formal framework for receiving or processing what he had experienced. This absence of framework was significant and underappreciated in the immediate post-war discussions of veteran reintegration. The soldier who had served on the Eastern Front, the airman who had flown over Britain in the Battle of Britain, the infantry officer who had fought in North Africa, all of them returned to a social context that had at least a shared narrative of the war, however distorted by the propaganda of the regime, that acknowledged their existence and their service. The U-boat veteran returned to a context where the submarine campaign was simultaneously too closely associated with the recent regime, too legally contested at the Nuremberg proceedings, and too technically obscure for the general public to have a stable frame for understanding it. The extraordinary casualty rate of the arm meant, additionally, that many communities had lost most or all of the men who had served in submarines, leaving no local veteran population around which the specific memory of the submarine experience could organize itself. The post-war testimonies of U-boat survivors, assembled across the decades by historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who recognized the historical significance of what these men had experienced, reveal a population navigating a particular form of survivor's guilt. In an arm where 3 out of every 4 men had been killed, the question of why any given individual had survived what accident of timing, assignment, patrol area, or pure chance had placed them on the side of the ledger that still had entries was not a comfortable one to sit with across a lifetime. Erich Topp addressed this question with a directness in his later interviews that distinguished his public engagement with the war's memory from the more guarded approaches that some survivors adopted. He did not, in those interviews, offer easy answers. He offered instead the honest observation that the question had no satisfying answer, that survival in the circumstances of the late Atlantic War was not primarily a function of individual virtue or capability, and that the men who had died were not, by any reasonable assessment, less deserving of survival than those who had lived. The physical act of returning to the places of the Atlantic War, the port towns of the French coast, the North Sea harbours, the waters themselves, was something that survivors handled differently. Some went back, some made pilgrimages to the concrete pens of Lorient and Brest that were, by the 1960s and 70s, accessible to civilian visitors, and stood in the spaces where they had prepared for patrols that many of their comrades had not returned from. Some found, in those revisitings, something that served the function of closure, an acknowledgement of the reality of what had happened in a physical place that still existed, that had not been erased or transformed beyond recognition. Others found the return intolerable and avoided it entirely, managing the memory at a distance that felt safer. The Allied side had its own complex relationship with the memory of the Atlantic. The merchant sailors who had crewed the convoys, those tens of thousands of men who had crossed the Atlantic in ships that might be sunk at any moment, in waters that offered survival times of minutes in winter temperatures, without the military support structures that the naval escorts received, were absorbed back into civilian life in most Allied countries, with a speed that left their experience largely unprocessed by the official commemorative culture of the post-war period. The military narrative of the Second World War, as it was constructed in the immediate post-war decades in Britain, Canada, the United States, and elsewhere, centered naturally on the campaigns and the commanders and the decisive battles. The merchant sailor, who had crossed the same ocean at the same time in a vessel with no weapons and no tactical recourse against a submarine attack, occupied a more awkward position in that narrative essential, clearly, to everything that the military narrative celebrated, but not easily assimilated into the stories the culture was building about courage and sacrifice and the nature of the war. The German submarine veterans faced an additional layer of complexity in memory management. The question of the regime they had served, the Third Reich's crimes, the systematic murder of Jewish people, the atrocities on the Eastern Front, the concentration camp system became progressively more fully understood by the German public in the post-war decades, and the generation that had served in its armed forces was required to position itself, individually and collectively, in relation to those crimes. Most U-boat veterans and most serious historians of the submarine campaign have concluded that the submarine arms operational activities sinking Allied shipping, fighting against Allied anti-submarine forces, were distinct from the ideological crimes of the regime in ways that made collective moral condemnation of submarine service itself an overreach. The individual cases are more complicated, and the question of what individual officers knew or suspected or chose not to investigate about the regime's broader activities is one that the historical record addresses with varying degrees of specificity across different individuals. Erich Topp's post-war public engagement with these questions was, by the assessment of most historians who have examined it, unusually thoughtful. He did not retreat from the complexity of his position, a decorated officer of the Wehrmacht who had served a criminal regime to the best of his professional ability into either denial or blanket self-condemnation. He engaged, over the decades of his long post-war life, with the specific questions that the submarine campaign raised about duty, professional ethics, and the relationship between military service and political accountability. His service in the Bundesmarine, after the war from which he retired as a rear admiral in 1969, placed him in a professional context that was itself navigating the question of institutional continuity, moral discontinuity between the Kriegsmarine and the new Federal German Navy, and his public statements across this period reflect a man who took that question seriously rather than one who wanted it to disappear. The weight of the Atlantic settled, in the decades after the war, into something that was simultaneously a chapter in the military history of the conflict and a continuing presence in the communities that had sent men to sea and not received them back. The port towns of the German North Sea coast, Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, the submarine bases maintained the memory through monuments and museums and the persistent presence of men who had been there. The Allied port cities Liverpool, Halifax, New York had their own memorial cultures, their own ways of marking what the ocean had taken. In Lorient, where the largest of the concrete U-boat pens still stands as one of the most substantial surviving structures of the Second World War, a submarine museum has been established in the post-war period that attempts to tell the story of the Battle of the Atlantic from the perspective of both sides, a decision that reflects the long view that time permits on a conflict, that no living participant now remains to have a personal stake in. Memory and history are not the same thing. Memory is partial, shaped by the needs of the present, liable to distortion by grief and guilt and pride, and the ordinary human tendency to make narratives that are tolerable to inhabit. History is the attempt to move beyond those distortions towards something more complete and more honest, an attempt that is never fully successful, but that is worthwhile, precisely because of the effort, rather than the result. The story of the U-boat aces of Kretschmer and Prien and Topp, and of the tens of thousands of men who served alongside them and beneath them and against them, deserves the full weight of the historical effort. It is a story about human beings in extreme conditions, about institutions and ideologies and technologies and the specific, irreplaceable specificity of individual lives. It deserves to be told as carefully as the evidence allows and received with the patience and attention that its complexity requires. Chapter 16, Erich Topp. The Life After the Deep Water. Of the three great aces, Erich Topp had the longest life, and in certain respects, the most complicated relationship with what he had been. He was born on the 2nd of July, 1914, 2 years after Kretschmer, 6 years after Prien, and he died on the 26th of May, 2005, at the age of 90. Between the boy who had joined the German Navy in 1934 and the old man who died in a Germany that had been reunified, rebuilt, and repositioned in the European order for more than a decade, there was a life that contained more transformation than most generations get the opportunity to experience. He had survived the war in ways that owed something to skill, something to the staff and training roles that had kept him off the frontline patrols during the most lethal phase of the Atlantic campaign, and something to the straightforward arbitrariness of survival in conditions where chance was a co-author of every outcome. He had commanded 10 patrols on U-552 and sunk 35 ships totaling 197,460 gross register tons, a figure that placed him third among all U-boat commanders in gross register tons, behind Kretschmer and Wolfgang Luth. He had received Germany's highest military decorations. He had fired the torpedo that sank USS Reuben James. He had watched the happy time turn into something else entirely, had trained the younger commanders who were sent out into the worsening conditions of the later war, and had endured the collapse of everything he had been trained to serve. After the surrender, Topp found himself in the position common to all senior German military officers: the necessity of accounting for his service within the framework of the post-war legal and social process, and then the slower, longer necessity of building a life in the new Germany that the occupation and partition had produced. He was interned briefly, as were most senior German officers, before his release. He worked in civilian occupations through the early 1950s, while the question of German rearmament was being debated and decided within the context of the Cold War and the emerging Atlantic Alliance. When the Bundeswehr, the new German Federal Armed Forces, was established in 1955, Topp joined the new Bundesmarine, beginning what amounted to a second military career in a navy that was constitutionally and institutionally different from the one he had served in, and that was committed, in its founding principles, to the values that the Kriegsmarine had conspicuously failed to uphold. His service in the Bundesmarine took him through staff roles and command positions across more than a decade, and he retired in 1969 with the rank of Konteradmiral Rear Admiral, having served the Federal German Navy with the same professional competence that the historical record shows he brought to everything he undertook. The Cold War context of his Bundesmarine service placed him in the NATO alliance structure, working alongside the navies that had fought against the Kriegsmarine in the Atlantic, the Royal Navy, the Canadian Navy, the United States Navy. The institutional relationships required by this context were, by all accounts, managed professionally, and without the personal awkwardness that a less self-possessed officer might have found overwhelming. The men on both sides of those professional relationships were, mostly, products of the same post-war generation that had decided that the new Germany and the new Atlantic Alliance were worth building together, whatever the recent past had contained. In his retirement, Topp engaged seriously with the historical record of the U-boat war in ways that went beyond the typical veteran's memoir. He collaborated with historians, provided testimony for documentary projects, and spoke publicly about the submarine campaign, with a combination of professional pride in the operational achievements of the arm and genuine moral seriousness about the context in which those achievements had been made. His autobiography, published in German in the 1999 year and later translated into English, was reviewed by historians as an unusually candid contribution to the memoir literature of the German military. Experience in the Second World War. It did not evade the difficult questions. It did not pretend that the regime served had been something other than what it was. It also did not adopt the retrospective posture of self-flagellation that some observers of the post-war German military memoir genre have identified as its own form of evasion, the performance of guilt as a substitute for actual engagement with the moral complexity of what had occurred. What Topp consistently emphasized in his later public statements and writings was the human reality of the submarine service, the specific, granular, irreducible humanity of the men who had served in the boats, not as heroes in the propaganda sense, not as victims in the revisionist sense, but as men who had possessed particular technical skills and particular professional commitments and particular loyalties to the people beside them, and who had applied those skills and commitments in the service of a state that did not deserve them. This framing professional honor, distinct from political loyalty, human decency, persisting within institutional evil, is one that has been contested by historians across the post-war decades, and the contestation is legitimate. The submarine arms operational activities were not identical to the ideological crimes of the regime, but they were not entirely separate from them either, and the clean line between naval professionalism and political complicity is harder to draw, on careful examination, than it appeared to some of the men who had served. Topp's engagement with the fate of Kretschmer and Prien in his later testimony adds a personal dimension to the historical record that the official documents cannot supply. He had known both men in the small, close world of the pre-war submarine arm. The young officers had overlapping training and assignment histories that brought them into each other's orbits. His comments on Kretschmer in later interviews consistently reflect a deep professional respect for the precision, the self-discipline, the tactical intelligence that had made Silent Otto the most effective individual practitioner of submarine warfare in the war's history. His comments on Prien are more charged. There is in them a quality of something close to awe for the boldness of Scapa Flow, combined with the specific melancholy of a man contemplating the fate of someone who had gone into the war at full speed and had not survived its middle years. The question of what the three aces meant to each other as men, as practitioners of the same craft, as participants in the same campaign, is one that the historical record can approach but not fully answer. The documentary evidence of their direct interactions is limited. They existed in the same institutional world, competed for the same tonnage records, served under the same commander, received their decorations in the same ceremonies. Whether friendship was a word that described any of their relationships is something the available sources do not establish clearly. What they clearly shared was the specific, demanding, isolating experience of commanding a submarine in the North Atlantic in conditions that tested every human quality to its maximum, an experience that creates, in those who share it, a form of mutual recognition that persists long after the specific circumstances have ended. Erich Topp outlived his century and then some. He was 90 years old when he died in 2005, the last living bridge to the world of the early U-boat aces, the last man whose personal memory connected the reader of the historical record to the lived reality of what the Atlantic War had been. His death closed a human chapter that the documents and the historians and the documentary filmmakers and the museum exhibits can approximate, but never quite replicate the chapter that exists in the specific interiority of a man who was there, who felt the ocean beneath a pressure hull, who heard the sound of his own boat being attacked, who made the calculations that the historical record describes as tactical decisions but that were, in the moment of their making, something much more immediate and much more personal than that. Chapter 17. What the Ocean Took. The Full Accounting. 6 years of war in the North Atlantic produced a ledger of loss that any serious engagement with the history must confront directly, not as a catalogue of statistics, but as a record of human lives, each one irreducible to the tonnage figures and casualty counts in which the campaign's scale is conventionally expressed. The numbers are necessary. They establish the magnitude of what occurred, provide the quantitative framework within which tactical and strategic analysis is conducted, and allow the comparative assessments that historical understanding requires. But they are not sufficient. The numbers are the map. The territory is the specific, unrepeatable, permanently lost reality of the lives they represent. Approximately 3,500 merchant ships were sunk in the Atlantic by German submarines across the 6 years of the campaign. Behind that figure are individual vessels, the SS Athenia, torpedoed on the very first day of the war, the tankers burning on the horizon off the American coast in the winter of 1942, the freighters scattered from convoy SC-122 and HX-229 in March of 1943, the cargo ships heading east from Halifax in the autumn of 1940, with fuel and food and ammunition that Britain needed to survive. Each of these vessels had a name, a registry, a crew, a cargo, a port of origin, and a destination it did not reach. The cumulative weight of that unreached destination of the food that did not arrive, the fuel that did not sustain aircraft and tanks, the munitions that did not reach the arsenals of the Allied armies, is something the historians can estimate in aggregate terms, but cannot fully calculate in its ramifying human consequences. The approximately 36,000 Allied merchant sailors killed in the Atlantic occupied, as noted in the previous chapter, an ambiguous position in the post-war commemorative culture of the nations that had sent them to sea. Britain was perhaps the most conscious of this ambiguity. and the debates within British official bodies in the decades after the war about how to appropriately honour the merchant navy, which had suffered casualty rates comparable to, and in some periods exceeding, those of the uniformed services, reflect the genuine difficulty of absorbing within the conventional military honours framework a service that was simultaneously indispensable to the war effort and structurally distinct from the armed forces. The Tower Hill Memorial in London, which commemorates merchant sailors and fishermen lost at sea with no known grave, stands as the primary national monument to this loss, a memorial that lists the names of thousands of men whose deaths occurred in the same waters, at the same hands, as the losses that the naval war memorials in naval ports also commemorate. The physical ocean itself is the largest archive of the campaign. The wrecks of merchant ships and U-boats, warships and tankers lie distributed across the floor of the North Atlantic in concentrations that reflect the geographical patterns of the campaign, the convoy routes running between Halifax and the British Isles, the patrol areas of the wolf packs that hunted them, the tactical choke points where the engagements concentrated in specific phases of the war. Modern deep-water survey technology has located and documented some of these wrecks with extraordinary precision, adding visual and physical confirmation to the documentary record. The images that have been recorded of these wrecks, vessels lying in the deep Atlantic, sometimes thousands of meters below the surface, preserved by cold and darkness in states that range from near intact to barely recognizable, have a quality that the archival photograph and the historical document cannot replicate. They are the thing itself, the physical remainder of events that happened to specific people in a specific piece of ocean, and that ended in the specific, permanent, irreversible way that sinking at sea ends things. The German side of the accounting, the 784 U-boats lost, the approximately 30,000 submarine crew members killed, has been documented with the thorough precision that German naval record-keeping maintained, even through the final phase of the war, and that the post-war research conducted by historians on both sides has substantially supplemented and verified. The individual boat histories, patrol records, tonnage figures, loss dates, circumstances of destruction where known have been assembled into reference works of remarkable completeness, the most comprehensive of which represent decades of dedicated scholarly work across multiple national archives. This body of research represents a form of commemoration as well as a form of scholarship, the insistence that each lost boat and each lost crew had a specific history that deserves to be recorded with the same precision that the more famous careers of the great aces have received. The places the campaign touched are its living memorial, Lorient, whose city centre was almost entirely destroyed by Allied bombing in the winter of 1942-43 raids, intended to destroy the submarine pens that proved effectively indestructible, was rebuilt. From the ruins, with a modernity that stood in stark contrast to the massive grey concrete structures that survived the bombing and that now anchor a museum complex. Halifax, Nova Scotia, from whose port thousands of Allied convoys departed across the years of the war, maintains the Atlantic Canada aviation and naval history through the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, which holds significant collections related to the Battle of the Atlantic. The Scottish anchorage of Scapa Flow, where Prien made his raid in October of 1939, is today a diving destination of international renown. The wrecks of the German fleet scuttled there after the First World War are visible to recreational divers, and the waters that witnessed the most audacious single night of the Atlantic War are now a site of peaceful underwater exploration. What the ocean took cannot be fully returned by any memorial or museum or documentary, but the act of remembering the sustained, serious, compassionate attention to what occurred in those waters across those years is not merely a sentimental exercise, it is an epistemological one. The Atlantic War shaped the world that followed it in ways that are still visible in the geopolitical structures and the military doctrines and the international maritime arrangements of the present. Understanding how it was fought, and by whom, and at what cost, is part of the larger project of understanding how the world in which we currently exist came to be. The U-boat aces and their opponents, the convoy commodores and their escorts, the merchant sailors and their passengers, The code breakers and the intelligence analysts, all of them contributed in their specific roles and specific moments to an outcome that neither side could clearly see while they were producing it. The historian's privilege, the privilege of hindsight, is the ability to trace that contribution backward from the outcome to the actions that produced it, and to give those actions the weight of meaning that their participants could rarely afford to contemplate in real time. The full accounting of the Atlantic is not a balance sheet that resolves into a clean sum. The losses on both sides resist the arithmetic of simple comparison. The tonnage sunk does not weigh equally with the lives lost. The tactical achievements of the U-boat aces do not translate simply into a moral assessment of the men who accomplished them. The courage of the men who sailed in submarines real, undeniable, verified by the most demanding operational record any military service in the modern era has produced, coexists with the fact that the regime in whose service that courage was deployed was responsible for crimes of a magnitude and a character that the courage itself cannot redeem, and that no professional honor can be claimed to stand entirely apart from. The full accounting holds all of these things simultaneously in the discomfort of their coexistence, because that is what the full accounting honestly contains. The ocean does not discriminate between sides. It treated the submarine and the convoy ship, the U-boat crew and the merchant sailor, with the same comprehensive indifference that makes it both the most dangerous and the most democratically honest of all military environments. It killed men of both sides with equal efficiency, in equal darkness, at equal depth. The Atlantic remembered nothing, the living kept the record. And the record, for as long as it is read with the seriousness it deserves, keeps the men who made it alive in the only way that time permits. Chapter 18. The Legacy. What the Wolves Left Behind. History does not stay in the past. It moves forward with the present, embedded in the institutions and doctrines and technologies and collective memories that each era inherits from the one before it. The Battle of the Atlantic left behind a legacy that reached into the Cold War navies of both sides, into the development of submarine and anti-submarine warfare doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century, and into the way that naval strategists and historians thought about the relationship between sea power and national survival. Understanding that legacy, what the wolves of the Atlantic bequeathed to the world that came after them, is the final task of this documentary. The most immediate institutional legacy was the continuation of the submarine as a central instrument of naval power. Both the Western Alliance and the Soviet Union drew from the lessons of the Atlantic campaign in building their Cold War submarine forces and the specific operational and technical challenges that the Battle of the Atlantic had identified: the problem of detection, the problem of underwater endurance, the problem of coordinating multiple submarines against defended convoys remained the defining parameters of submarine warfare doctrine across the post-war decades. The Type XXI U-boat, which Topp had been involved with at the end of the war, was studied intensively by American, British and Soviet naval architects after the surrender, and its influence on the submarine designs of the 1950s and 60s was direct and substantial. The shape of the modern nuclear submarine streamlined, optimized for submerged speed, designed around the premise that a submarine should spend most of its time underwater, owes more than is often acknowledged to the design philosophy that was being developed in the German shipyards in the last years of the war. The Allied anti-submarine legacy was equally significant. The operational research units that had contributed to the defeat of the Wolfpacks, applying mathematical analysis to the size of convoys, the optimal spacing of escorts, the probability calculations governing submarine detection, established the methodology of operational analysis as a discipline that would be applied to military problems across the post-war period. The convoy system itself, validated by 6 years of Atlantic experience, became a permanent feature of Allied naval planning for the Cold War scenario of a Soviet submarine threat to transatlantic supply lines, the same basic geometry of merchant ships and escort vessels that had crossed the wartime. Atlantic was maintained in the planning documents of NATO for decades after the war ended, updated with the technologies of each succeeding era, but structurally recognizable as the descendant of what had been learned the hard way between 1939 and 1945. The intelligence legacy was perhaps the most consequential of all, though it was also the most delayed in its public acknowledgement. The existence of the Bletchley Park code-breaking operation, the fact that Allied forces had been reading German Enigma encrypted communications throughout significant portions of the war, was not publicly disclosed until the 1970s, when declassification of the relevant documents allowed historians to access the evidence that had been kept secret for 3 decades to protect intelligence sources and methods that remained operationally relevant during the Cold War. The revelation transformed the historical understanding of the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that required substantial revision of previously published works. The oscillating pattern of convoy losses that had seemed, in the earlier histories, to reflect the varying tactical competence of both sides revealed itself, on closer examination, as partly a reflection of the alternating periods of intelligence advantage and intelligence blackout that the code-breaking war had produced. The careers of the 3 aces left institutional legacies as well as historical ones. Otto Kretschmer's post-war Bundesmarine service contributed to the building of a professional culture in the Federal German Navy that was serious about both operational excellence and the moral dimensions of military service, a culture that drew on the genuine professional competence of the wartime submarine arm while attempting to disconnect it from the ideological context that had given that competence its wartime purpose. His example as a commander, the discipline, the economy, the self-possession under extreme pressure continued to be studied in submarine training programs long after his specific tactical innovations had been overtaken by technological change. Erich Topp's contribution to the Bundesmarine had similar characteristics, the transmission of professional standards and tactical judgment from the wartime generation to the Cold War one, in a form that acknowledged the moral complexity of the inheritance without being paralyzed by it. Günther Prien left no post-war legacy in the personal sense. He died at sea, presumed in March of 1941, before the war was half over, and the specific knowledge and judgment that he had accumulated across his career died with him in the cold waters west of Ireland. What he left was the event, the raid on Scapa Flow, which has proven to be one of the most durably memorable individual actions of the entire war. It appears in virtually every serious history of the Second World War at sea. It has been the subject of dedicated monographs, documentary treatments, and popular histories in multiple languages. The Churchill barriers that were built to close the channels he had exploited still stand in the Orkney Islands, visible from the road that runs across them, the most tangible, surviving, physical consequence of a single night's work in October of 1939. The broader legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic for our understanding of modern warfare is one that the strategic studies community has engaged with persistently across the post-war decades. The campaign demonstrated, in ways that the strategic planners of the 1930s had theorized but not fully proven, that a sustained attack on the maritime logistics of a maritime power could be decisive, that controlling the sea lanes that connected an island economy to its suppliers and allies was a form of strategic leverage of the first order. It also demonstrated, with equal clarity, that such an attack could be defeated, that the combination of technology, intelligence, doctrine, and the productive capacity of a determined and adequately resourced industrial economy could overcome even a tactically innovative and individually courageous submarine arm if the defense was given sufficient time and resources to develop and deploy its countermeasures. The human legacy, the memory that the survivors carried and transmitted, and that the historians and filmmakers and documentary makers have worked to preserve and extend, is the one that most resists systematic summary. It is carried in specific stories rather than general principles, in the particular rather than the universal. The story of the man on the bridge of a merchant vessel watching a torpedo wake approach without the ability to maneuver away from it. The story of the depth charge attack experienced from inside a pressure hull at depth, the specific, physical terror of concussive pressure waves in a confined metal space. The story of the commander in the conning tower of a surface submarine in the mid-Atlantic gap on a clear night, calculating speed and course and bearing against a convoy that cannot see him and does not yet know he is there. These are the stories that carry the weight of what the Atlantic War was, at the level where history and human experience meet. The three men at the center of this documentary, Kretschmer, Prien, Topp, were extraordinary practitioners of an extraordinarily demanding craft. They were also products of their time, their culture, and their institutional environment in ways that complicated the simple heroism that the propaganda of the regime wanted to attribute to them, and that the post-war revisionism sometimes wanted to deny them entirely. The honest account holds both of these things, the genuine operational achievement and the genuinely problematic context, without resolving them into a single, comfortable verdict. History at its most useful is precisely this kind of discomfort. The discomfort of complexity held honestly, without the false resolution of premature judgment. The ocean is still there, it has always been there, and it will be there long after the last person who knew any of these men by name has also gone. The wrecks in the Atlantic deepen slowly under the sediment of decades. The concrete pens at Lorient stand in the salt air. The names on the Tower Hill Memorial weather through the seasons in London. The Churchill barriers carry traffic across the Orkney channels in all weathers. And the story of what happened in those waters between 1939 and 1945 continues to be told in books and lectures and archives and, yes, in long documentary nights like this one, because it deserves to be told, because the people it describes deserve to be remembered, and because the lessons it contains are the kind that no generation can afford to leave entirely to the last. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour the clock shows, whatever degree of wakefulness or half-sleep you have arrived at somewhere in these hours, thank you for staying with this story. It is a story that belongs to all of us who inherit the world that the Atlantic War helped produce. The men who fought it, on both sides, in the cold water and the cold dark, deserve at minimum to be known. This has been one attempt to know them. If the ocean carried you somewhere tonight, if the rhythm of these words and this history did what long-form documentary is made to do, then something of what those men experienced has passed, however faintly, across the decades and the distance. That transmission is not nothing. In the long accounting of what we owe the past, it is, perhaps, something. Sleep well, the convoy is through. This concludes the full 18-chapter documentary. Fall asleep to the entire history of U-boat aces, Kretschmer, Prien, and Topp, the Battle of the Atlantic. 1939 to 1945. If this series gave you something company in the long hours, a thread of history to follow into sleep, a reason to stay, please leave this video playing and consider subscribing for the next long-form night documentary. Watch time is the signal the algorithm reads. Your continued listening is the most direct endorsement you can give. We will see you on the next voyage.